Now to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak. She's speaking at the summit where the Prime Minister is. Let's listen now.
That we would like to echo to the Government of Canada, to the Prime Minister. Number one, of course, is to make sure that within 1 year that there's a follow-up meeting to this. There's a lot of discussion. The last meeting that happened was, of course, with First Nations chiefs, and a Prime Minister was 13 years ago. And prior to that, it was in the 1981, prior to Constitution discussions and talks. And I think that that's too many years in between to not speak to First Nations directly. We do appreciate when they do come to the Assembly of First Nations, but I really think when the government organizes a meeting like this to really talk to First Nations, that's so critically important. So we do call on the government to have a follow-up meeting 1 year from now, similar to this, of course, with working with leadership from coast to coast to coast. We also remind, of course, the Government of Canada today to listen more and speak less. I think First Nations have been waiting a long time to speak and get their messages out, so we need to do that. Also follow through on promises to close the First Nations infrastructure gap. We have a $350 billion gap in this country when it comes to our kids in our First Nations communities, and like all of you that are here, you want your children to have access to good, reliable schools. You want your children to have access to high-speed internet, things that we Canadians take for granted, access to clean, accessible drinking water, proper infrastructure in their homes, and proper homes, including community safety and education systems that work for all of us. We have to build a different country, and we have to build it together. And that means closing the infrastructure gap in this country. And it's a big price tag, but it's because there's been so many years of neglect in this country when it comes to infrastructure that the gap keeps widening and widening. And many of these communities, basic things like a school bus, because the roads are so maybe not paved in many communities, it's hard on them, and their infrastructure breaks down a lot quicker. And so let's fix those things together as we build a different country and make a better life for children on and off reserve, regardless of where they are, including with health and so many other discussions that we have to have on closing that gap. But let's talk about closing that infrastructure gap. Let's find a plan forward together. How does that look 1 year from now? How does that look 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now? I know we had a commitment to close that gap to 2030. We're very off target on that, and we look to all of you to help us to close that gap. So I can't stress that enough, that I don't want my little grandchildren someday, your little grandchildren, having these same discussions. Let's work together and fix that in a good way so that Canada progresses forward. It's a very rich country around the world, and everybody wants Canada. Everybody wants the minerals and water. We have beautiful fresh water that we have to protect, and let's do it in a balanced way as well. Think 7 generations ahead. I'd also want to say I think the first order of business for the fall for this new government, of course to the Senate as well, is to introduce the Clean Water, a Clean Water Act. I know that reintroduce it. It fell on the order paper. I know that there was people like Senator Prosper, others that wanted to step forward and help fix some of the issues in that bill. Currently, the bill that we have is, it needs to be changed. The old bill needs to be created with new one and co-developed with First Nations. So we asked the Government of Canada to make sure to reintroduce that quickly. We also ask that the federal government review the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Act that was signed and pushed forward in the 1930s without the First Nations in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta Treaty First Nations. They really need to come to the table and speak that through. And of course, we also need to get on with policing as an essential service, and of course, the jurisdiction on policing. I know that these are not easy discussions to be had, but one police officer in each community is insufficient, and we have to do a better job of pushing forward First Nations policing services. I know at one point we had 58. We're now down to 36. Why is there a decline? Meanwhile, First Nations policing services, when we police ourselves and do our own policing within our communities, there's less deaths, there's less triggers happening on our people, because I think when have a First Nation-led police force, it just shows. You see one police force, I think in Ontario, they've never ever had to shoot anyone or kill anyone during policing during their 30-plus years in business. And so we look at that, and I think that First Nations, we look to a new deal, on policing. And I know that this is off script, but I'm going to say it anyways. The Government of Canada has to get out of the way. As a mother and an eventual grandmother, I am, a First Nations person. And the Inuit don't go through this, neither do the Métis. But First Nations were the only people legislated around the entire world. And every time we have a baby, the government wants to decide if my child is First Nations or not. And with the eventual termination probably of First Nations people, that they want to limit about how many generations after me are First Nations. It's a second generation cutoff under the Indian Act. And it's very destructive to our women, to our people, to our communities. And I think that the government has to come in good faith as well to have that tough discussion. I know that there's a certain bill before the Senate, I believe. But at the same time, let's get rid of the second generation cutoff once and for all. There's many experts out there, people like Pam Palmater, others that are that have been doing lots of work on this over the years. A few other women, Rachel, that had, that message today. And, there's lots of people and women that have been fighting for this for a long time. Let's fix that once and for all. So I think those are some things that we should fix together. And I know that we're in a new world, a changing world. We stand with Canadians against Trump's, his economic push on our own country. But what we stand together with all of you as First Nations always have done since the creation of this country. We're founding partners in this country. All land in Canada is traditional First Nations territory that we shared with this entire country. We love Canadians. We want to stand up for Canada against illegal tariffs. At the same time, of course, we look to make sure that no more colonialism happens within our own country. We push back on that. And just lots of work to do. And I think that we can do that by working together. Again, we stand with Canadians. We also say that when we do pass bills, like Bill 5 in Parliament, that we do it together in a better way. Canadians included, environmentalists, First Nations, and sometimes those views differ from each other, but we can do better by writing better bills when we do things less rushed and more together. And I think that, when it comes to the economy, First Nations are never one to push back on the economy. We've always been very generous people, but at the same time, we want to make sure that our rights are respected in this country. So
what did you make of the Prime Minister's remarks?
Look, I think he's got to come up with some commitments, firm commitments, hopefully by the end of this day and in the weeks ahead, and to make sure that there's no big budget cuts. We didn't talk about the budget. I know that there's budget cuts being proposed across this country, but I know that previous prime ministers, knowing how tight budgets are for First Nations already and how huge the gaps are, they need to exclude First Nations people from those budget cuts, along with things like healthcare, things that are important to all Canadians, and closing that gap between all people.
So you said yesterday that you were coming in today giving the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt. Based on how things are going so far, the fact that we weren't able to hear your speech, do you still feel that way?
Look, I've given, during my speech, and we'll give you a copy of that, we had given him a list of, not suggestions, and we've given him the opportunity to respond to First Nations on some of these issues, which I just talked about, on policing, on no budget cuts, and on closing the infrastructure gap. So I look to him to make that commitment.
What do you make of the fact that there was no open media access to this summit?
Well, that's unfortunate. I'm not sure why that had happened. And I just think that the media should be in that room listening to First Nations people. And I know, like I said, it's the first, the first meeting of this kind in 13 years. And I know that the conversations are always difficult. But number one, I'm glad we're finally at the table together. Number two, the media should never be.
Did the Prime Minister's staff ask you if it was okay that we couldn't cover your speech? Was that something they consulted with you on, or did they just make that decision on their own?
They must have just made that decision. Yeah, of course we're not the ones organizing today. We didn't, rightfully so. The Assembly of First Nations, of course, walks a fine line, as many people, know how that can be. And so when they're going to have a meeting at this magnitude, the government should be the one organizing and making sure that things are running smooth.
National Chief, can I ask you about this? You're looking on the Crown side. A former Grand Chief of the Cree Nation is sitting on the Crown side. A Métis leader for Northern Manitoba is on the Crown side. You have Annie Baptiste, etc. It seems to a non-Indigenous person like me that the Prime Minister is trying to make a statement by saying, we have Indigenous representatives, elected leaders on our side. What do you make of that? Does it make a difference to have Indigenous people on the Crown side?
Well, absolutely it does. I think it's a positive thing. I think that I'm happy that there's 8 First Nations people, whether they were NDP, Conservative, Liberal, the other one, the Bloc Québécois. I think we have a First Nation person in there. I think it absolutely makes a difference when there's First Nations people in every single political party. I lift my hands up to all of them. It's important that you do have those voices of lived experience, particularly with the Minister of Indian Affairs. She lives on reserve and has lived on reserve. She knows what we have been through, and I hope that her colleagues listen to her around cabinet table, because I think that she could really help them move towards a different relationship. Like I said, our relationship hasn't always been easy the past 150 years, but all of us are going to make a difference and make it better so that our grandchildren aren't having these same conversations.
In a nutshell, on C5, would you say the Prime Minister has been able this morning to put most of your concerns to rest?
I think first of all, I'd heard one chief in there that said, look, this isn't consultation. And I know that there's more conversations to be had, and I wish that you were all in there to hear that.
National Chief, there was a chief actually who said this is not a consultation, this is a protest yesterday. So if it's not a consultation, how is the government supposed to move forward and consult and address these concerns? Have they offered you any means of doing that?
Not yet. I know that there's what did they say, $40 million? I don't think, number one, that's enough for Métis, First Nations, Inuit. That's very small when you're in these northern communities trying to bring people together to find out what consultation is. But I think that in that room, you'll find, with all of people's minds and heads and really listening together, they'll come out with the best outcomes. But they have to listen to each other, and I think more talking and less listening to First Nations is not going to be helpful today. I mean, we're thankful that some of the technical briefings happened yesterday, but I think the government listening to people on the ground from First Nations, telling them how it is and how things work in this country will be more beneficial for them.
So as you say, it is about relationship building?
Do you think that...
All right, we are listening to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy
I'm glad
Woodhouse Nepinak. She is speaking outside of the summit that's underway right now in Gatineau, Quebec, with the Prime Minister. She said a number of things. She said that the government needs to talk less and listen more to First Nations. She said that the Prime Minister needs to come up with some commitments. She has given the Prime Minister a list of issues, including budgets, policing, and she hopes that there will be more meetings in the future, and that she's glad they're all sitting down at the table today. So on that note, the PM said earlier today he is ready to listen to First Nations leaders on his government's major projects legislation. We're going to have more on that straight ahead. Don't go away.